As we begin working on the slow etude for this year, the first thing we need to address is our musical terms. There's nothing too unusual in this one, with the possible exception of the tempo marking Adagio cantabile. Basically, that means that you're going to play slowly and in a singing style. So your approach is going to be very smooth, very connected or legato for the most part, and very expressive in the way that singers tend to approach their music. Secondly, mark your flats wherever you think you might miss them, or where you do actually miss them while you're practicing. There are 6 flats in the key signature in concert pitch, and since there's a tendency to miss those concert G flats and C flats, go ahead and mark those. Don't keep making the same mistakes while practicing and say, well, I won't make that mistake again. Yes, you will. You'll make the mistake over and over again and develop bad habits that are harder to work out later. There is no shame in marking anything in your part that you're likely to forget about. You have some double flats in there and other possibly unfamiliar things. Mark all of that. Mark anything that you're afraid that you might miss so that you're less likely to miss it in the audition. Third, plan and mark your breaths. Every time I make an instructional video on a Lions Band Etude, I mention this, and it is worth repeating. The music always needs to determine where you breathe, not your felt need for air. And if you have your breaths marked, you're more likely to breathe in those musically appropriate places. You don't want to get into a situation where you're going on just your felt need for another breath to determine where you breathe. That's going to lead to some problems. One is that you're going to breathe in places that are musically inappropriate. Well, that's an obvious one. But what really tends to happen is that you find yourself skipping a good, musical, appropriate, great place to breathe because you don't feel like you need more air. So you don't take one. And then you come on one of those long, slow, flowing phrases, and you don't have enough breath to make it to the end of that phrase without breathing in some very poor place. If you have your breaths marked, you're much less likely to make that mistake, because you're going to remember when you see that mark that this is a place where you need to take a breath, even if you don't feel like you need it in the moment. Also, having your breaths marked helps to stave off the effects of nervousness. When we're nervous, we tend to take shallow breaths and to take them too frequently. If we have all the breaths marked and we've practiced breathing deeply in all the same places every time we play an etude, then that habit kicks in, and even though we're nervous and likely to take shallow breaths, we still get into that old habit of taking deep breaths in all of those same places. Marking your breaths will make your phrasing better. It'll make you less likely to get into a situation where you need air before you have another good chance to breathe, and it just helps a little to mitigate the effects of nervousness in the audition. Next, practice with a metronome. Often in the slower etudes, we think that we don't need the metronome because we don't need that beat to drive us forward. But actually, the slow etude is the place where we're more likely to lose time or be inconsistent with time because we don't have that driving beat built into the piece. Even here, use the metronome to make sure that you're playing consistently, and practice both slower and faster than the written tempo. Practicing the slow etude, even at something like half tempo, can really do wonderful things for your phrasing. For an etude like this marked 60 to 72 beats per minute, you're going to be playing anywhere from like 30 to 36 if you go half tempo. And if you can play that with anything approaching the same breathing and the same phrasing at 30, then at 60 it's not going to be very hard at all. The metronome then becomes a tool for working not only on your timing but on your breath control, particularly in a slow piece. Fifth, and this sort of goes along with the idea of metronome practice, you need to subdivide. In faster etudes, a lot of times there are plenty of moving notes that pretty much subdivide the piece for you. And you're able to more or less keep consistent time just by virtue of the moving eighths and 16th notes that you might encounter in a faster piece. But in a slow piece like this one, where there's a lot of half notes and dotted quarter notes and things, if you're not thinking the 8th note and 16th note subdivisions, if you're just thinking long, long, short, short, or whatever, instead of thinking one and two and or one and a two and a through these longer notes, chances are that your longer notes are going to be random and inaccurate lengths. Subdividing helps you to maintain consistent rhythm, even at slow tempos. The metronome can help you with that because most of the time you can set the metronome to subdivide into eighth notes or 16th notes or whatever you want for you. Additionally, subdivision helps you to manipulate tempo for musical effect in a responsible way. When you listen to the example videos that I've provided, you'll note that I take some liberty with tempo in this slower etude, but as I do so, I'm always thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, even as I make manipulations in the tempo. What that does is it helps me to slow down and speed up in a measured way. And so instead of sounding random or inaccurate or like I don't know how to count, it actually sounds like what I'm doing is purposeful, and therefore it's musically effective. Your judges will be able to tell the difference between someone taking a measured and appropriate liberty with timing for musical effect and someone who just can't count. Sixth, allow the dynamic level and the tempo to rise and fall slightly with phrases. So you have some dynamic markings here and there, a couple rallentandos, but it's pretty sparse really in terms of marking there in the part. Therefore, if you want to play with musical effectiveness, you're going to want to not only observe the written dynamic and timing and style markings, but also the ones that are really just implied. This is an area where a private teacher is particularly important, as that person can give you some guidance on how to do this. But generally, you're going to find that your phrases will rise to a climax and fall to a resolution, and as they rise to that climactic point, you let the dynamic level rise just slightly, and then as it falls back down, you let the dynamic level lower just slightly, and really the same thing with tempo, as I was mentioning a minute ago. So, you have the subdivisions. Like I said, you push the subdivisions ahead just a little bit as the phrase rises to that climactic point, and then you might let it slow down just a little bit as well. And if you do that in a balanced way, it's very effective. Additionally, those little added in, very slight retards at the end of phrases can help you to create some bigger and better places to breathe, so that not only do you achieve a greater musical effect, but you also have more time just to get a good breath of air before the next musical phrase. Last thing with regard to this, overdo the contrast just a little bit. You're never doing quite as much, quote, musicality as you think you are. So basically any contrasts created for musical effect should be exaggerated just a bit in order to make sure that they're noticed by listeners. And if you're unsure about this, get somebody to listen to you play, or record yourself, do something so that you can tell that it's really not too much. Chances are it's probably not. Next, a special note for trombone players regarding legato. This is a smooth legato etude, and many players just don't seem to understand legato technique very well, or at least they understand it incompletely. This can be a challenging technique to master, but it is fairly simple to explain. Now, most of your method books are going to define the technique needed for legato simply by saying to tongue softly. You might see it say use a do or lu tongue. Well, that's right as far as it goes. I mean, we do tongue softly in legato most of the time. But there's something that they're missing that I think is even more important, and that is when you play legato, there needs to be constant sound, constant buzz. That's what legato is. It means connected. And no amount of tonguing the beginning of the note softly is going to make the end of the note connected to the beginning of the next note. You need constant sound, constant buzz, and that is created by constant airflow. The way I conceive of this is that my lungs, my breathing apparatus, they need to feel like I'm playing long notes while I'm playing a series of legato notes. Play each legato phrase on a single blow, as it were. Now, one way to check to make sure that you're using constant airflow correctly is to smear through the legato passages. In an etude like this, if you take the tongue away and leave everything else the same, if it sounds like a smeary, drawly mess, that's actually probably right, and you're using your air correctly. And then if you'll just add a little tongue back in and move the slide accurately with the tongue exactly, and keep that airflow going constantly, you're going to find that you get a really good result. What we find a lot of times is that players tend to kind of bubble the airflow in order to cover up poor articulation or poor slide action. And so when you do this, it sounds like this kind of wah, 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 wah sort of effect when they're trying to smear through it. So even when the tongue is taken away, there's still a sort of articulation on there. And it doesn't sound much better when the tongue is added back in. When you have that constant airflow, that constant buzz when you're smearing, and so it just sounds like wah through the passage. And then you add just a bit of tongue in there to clean it up, just enough to disrupt the sound so that the smear is eliminated. You're going to get the result that you want. Legato can be difficult, but it's also simple. If you're thinking not only to tongue softly, but to maintain constant airflow and constant buzz, you're going to be much more successful. For tuba and euphonium players, the slurring is typically much simpler than legato is for trombonists. For you, I would suggest that you make sure to tongue where it is marked to tongue and slur where it is marked slurred. The euphonium in particular sounds very good slurred, and it's very easy to slur well on the euphonium, and it is tempting to slur even when it says not to. But this particular etude uses a mix of tonguing and slurring very effectively, and you want to make sure that you do exactly what it says. Because see, the problem is when it's so easy to sound good, yes on the tuba, but especially on the euphonium, people will just slur everything in a slow etude. And the musical effect is just not quite correct. Observe the articulations that are marked. Lastly, listen to some 19th century opera arias as well as popular songs from that time to get some ideas on style. The Boxman book that your etudes are taken from takes most or all of its lyrical melodies out of the vocal repertoire from about that period. And so if you want to get some ideas of the style that he's looking for, then listen to singers in that style. Besides, it's marked cantabile in a singing style. So listen to singers and copy them as best you can. That is going to give you the best idea of the musical result that you should be seeking.